The air in the lawyer's office smelled of old leather and colder ambition. 12 people sat in silence, but only one man was smiling. Richard Hensley leaned back in his chair like a king already crowned, his tailored suit catching the light from the window behind the mahogany desk. Beside him, his 2 children sat with matching expressions of quiet entitlement, already spending money they hadn't yet received. At the far end of the room, half forgotten in the corner, sat Daniel, the stepson nobody had bothered to introduce to the attorney when he walked in. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and began reading. The estate, the lake house, the vacation properties in Aspen and Naples, the investment accounts, the vintage car collection, the yacht docked in Charleston, all of it, one by one, assigned to Richard and his children. Daniel sat with his hands folded, waiting for his name to be called. It wasn't. Not once. Richard's smile widened with every line the lawyer read, as if each asset were a personal victory over a man who could no longer fight back. Then Mr. Abernathy paused, adjusted his glasses, and reached for a final item. A single sealed envelope, plain and unremarkable, resting alone on the desk. For Daniel, he said, as specified, voting shares, Class B. The room went still. Richard's children exchanged glances. Nobody in that office understood what those words meant, least of all Daniel himself. He rose slowly, walked to the desk, and took the envelope. It was lighter than he expected, almost weightless. He turned it over in his hands, searching for meaning in the plain white paper, in the neat, deliberate handwriting of a man who had never done anything by accident. Whatever this was, his grandfather had wanted him, and only him, to have it. Richard was the first to laugh. It started low, almost polite, then rose into something sharper, the kind of laugh meant to be heard by everyone in the room. Voting shares, he repeated, shaking his head. In a company that's practically mine now. That's rich. Even in death, the old man had a sense of humor. His daughter smirked. His son didn't even bother looking up from his phone. You know what that is, don't you, Daniel? Richard said, rising from his chair, straightening his jacket with theatrical calm. That's a pity gift. A consolation prize. Grandpa felt guilty, so he tossed you some paper that means nothing. He gestured toward the envelope still resting in Daniel's hand. Frame it. Hang it on your wall. It's the closest you'll ever get to owning anything in this family. A few muffled laughs rippled through the room. Nobody corrected him. Nobody even paused to ask what Class B shares actually meant, because to them, the answer already seemed obvious. Daniel had always been the leftover. Why would today be any different?
Daniel felt the heat rise in his chest, the old familiar sting of being small in a room full of people who had decided long ago that he didn't matter. He could have argued. He could have asked Mr. Abernathy to explain the envelope's meaning right there in front of everyone. Instead, he said nothing. He folded the envelope once, slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and stood. His mother wouldn't meet his eyes. Richard was already laughing again, already moving on, already certain the war was over before it had begun. Daniel walked out of the office without a word, carrying, in silence, something none of them understood yet. Daniel hadn't always been invisible. There was a time, long before Richard Hensley entered their lives, when it had just been Daniel, his mother, and the quiet rhythm of a life built on modest means and hard-earned peace. Then came the wedding, the moving trucks, the new house with rooms too large to fill with anything but silence. And slowly, without ever announcing it, Daniel became someone who didn't quite belong. Richard had a way of rearranging a room without raising his voice. Family dinners became business meetings Daniel wasn't invited to. Conversations about the company, contracts, board decisions, quarterly numbers happened behind closed doors, and when Daniel walked in by accident, The talking always seemed to stop a beat too soon. His step-siblings absorbed the language of wealth like it was their birthright. Daniel learned instead how to sit quietly in rooms where he wasn't wanted. But his grandfather had noticed. While the rest of the family gathered around Richard's ambitions, Grandpa Elias would slip away to the study with Daniel, 2 cups of coffee and an old leather ledger between them. He taught him to read a balance sheet before Daniel could legally sign a lease. He explained voting structures, board dynamics, the quiet architecture of real control, not as lessons, but as conversations between equals. Money changes hands, Elias told him once, closing the ledger with a soft thud. Power stays where people forget to look. Daniel hadn't understood what that meant back then. He'd assumed it was just an old man's way of making him feel useful in a house where he otherwise wasn't. Now, standing outside the lawyer's office with a sealed envelope in his pocket, those quiet afternoons in the study didn't feel like kindness anymore. They felt like preparation. The apartment was quiet the way it always was, small, dim, and honest in a way Richard's mansion never had been. Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, the envelope placed in front of him like something that might still change its mind about existing. He'd carried it all day without opening it. Through the humiliation, through the silent drive home, through the hours of staring at his ceiling pretending he wasn't thinking about it. Now, finally alone, he broke the seal.
Inside was a single certificate, crisp and official, along with a short cover letter from the law firm. His eyes moved over the words slowly, half expecting Richard to be right, expecting some symbolic gesture, some meaningless keepsake dressed up in legal language. 51% of Class B voting shares, Hensley Manufacturing Group. He read the line twice, then a third time. 51%. Not a token, not a gift for sentiment's sake, a majority. He didn't fully understand what Class B shares meant, not yet. The ledger lessons from years ago felt distant, half-remembered fragments rather than a map. But even without the details, one word kept surfacing in his mind, refusing to be ignored. Control. His hands weren't quite steady as he set the certificate down. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent, unaware that somewhere in a small apartment, a piece of paper worth more than anyone in that lawyer's office understood was sitting under a flickering kitchen light. Richard thought he'd inherited an empire. Daniel wasn't sure yet what he was holding, but he knew with a certainty that hadn't existed in him that morning that his grandfather hadn't made a mistake. He had made a decision, and Daniel was only beginning to understand why. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Around 2 a.m., Daniel found himself digging through the single box he'd kept from his grandfather's study, the one Richard hadn't bothered to claim, dismissing it as clutter not worth the shelf space. Inside, beneath old photographs and a chess set missing half its pieces, sat the ledger, the same one from all those quiet afternoons years ago. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking with age, and began turning pages filled with his grandfather's neat, deliberate handwriting. Inventory lists, notes on suppliers, small sketches of company org charts from decades past. Then, tucked between 2 pages near the back, a folded note slipped out. Daniel unfolded it slowly. The real inheritance isn't the house. It's not the accounts. Read Section 14C of the bylaws before you decide what you've been given. No signature. He didn't need one. His pulse quickened as he set the ledger aside and pulled out his laptop. Searching through old company documents he barely remembered his grandfather ever showing him. Section 14C. A clause buried deep in the bylaws, written in dense legal language about voting classes, board composition, and shareholder control thresholds. Whatever it said, his grandfather hadn't wanted him to stumble onto it by accident. He wanted him to go looking. Why go through such trouble? Why encode an inheritance in riddles and hidden clauses instead of simply explaining it outright?
and more unsettling than either question. If this had been planned so carefully, so deliberately, for so long, who else in the family might already know?
Mr. Abernathy's office looked different in daylight, smaller, less intimidating than it had felt during the reading. He didn't seem surprised to see Daniel standing in his doorway, ledger tucked under one arm, questions written plainly across his face. "I wondered how long it would take you," the old lawyer said, gesturing for him to sit. Daniel didn't waste time. He placed the folded note on the desk, along with the certificate from the envelope. "What is Section 14C? What did my grandfather actually give me?" Abernathy studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether Daniel was ready for the answer. Then he leaned back and let out a slow breath. "Your grandfather restructured Hensley Manufacturing shares almost 6 years ago," he said, quietly, legally, without telling Richard or anyone else in the family. "Why?" "Because he didn't trust Richard," Abernathy said plainly. "Not with the company, and certainly not with the people who depended on it. Richard has always been very good at accumulating money. He has never been particularly good at earning loyalty or keeping promises." He tapped the certificate on the desk. "Class A shares, the ones Richard and his children inherited, carry financial value, dividends, ownership stake, the appearance of wealth. But Class B shares," he said, meeting Daniel's eyes, "carry voting control, board appointments, major company decisions, structural authority." Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. "So Richard owns the money. And you," Abernathy said, "own the power to decide what happens to it." The words settled over the room like a held breath finally released. "Your grandfather didn't leave you a leftover, Daniel," the lawyer added quietly. "He left you the only thing that could stop Richard from doing whatever he wanted with this company." Daniel sat in silence, the weight of it only beginning to settle. For the first time since the reading, he didn't feel small at all. Word moves fast in families built on money. By the time Daniel got home, his phone had already buzzed twice. A text from his mother, careful and searching, asking if everything was all right with the estate paperwork. He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to guess how she'd found out. Abernathy's office wasn't exactly built for secrets, and Richard had spent enough years cultivating relationships with anyone who might carry information back to him. By evening, the calls started. The first was from Richard's daughter, her voice sweeter than he'd ever heard it, laced with a curiosity she clearly hadn't planned on feeling. He didn't answer that one either. The second call was Richard himself.
Gone was the smirk from the lawyer's office, the theatrical confidence that had filled the room like expensive cologne. His voice was tighter now, quicker, searching for footing on ground that had just shifted beneath him. "Daniel, let's talk. Family to family. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about the paperwork." Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "There's no misunderstanding, Richard." A pause. Then quieter. "You don't know what you're holding. You don't know how any of this works. Let me help you. Before you make a mistake you can't take back." But Daniel understood something now that Richard didn't yet grasp. Every dollar Richard spent, every contract he signed, every decision he made as head of Hensley Manufacturing, all of it now ran through boardroom approval. And Daniel controlled the votes. The man who'd called him worthless in front of the entire family was now the one who needed him. And for the first time, Daniel intended to make him wait. The boardroom on the 14th floor of Hensley Manufacturing had never seen Daniel step through its doors, not once in all the years Richard had run it like a private kingdom. He noticed the shift the moment he walked in. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. 6 board members, most of them Richard's hand-picked allies, turned toward the door with the same startled expression, as if a ghost had wandered into the wrong meeting.
Richard rose immediately, jaw tight beneath a forced smile. "Daniel, this is a shareholders' meeting. I'm not sure." "I know what it is," Daniel said, setting a folder on the long glass table. Inside was the certificate, along with formal notice from Abernathy's office confirming his standing. "I believe I'm required to be here." One of the older board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vance, reached for the documents and read them carefully. Her eyebrows lifted a fraction. "This is legitimate," she said, more to the room than to Richard. "That's impossible," Richard snapped. "He doesn't know the first thing about running this company." "I don't need to run it," Daniel said, calmly. "I need to vote on it." The room shifted again, this time from disbelief into something colder, more calculating, because everyone at that table understood exactly what voting control meant. Executive salaries, contract renewals, budget approvals. Richard's compensation package, quietly inflated over the years, would now require a majority vote to renew. Richard's composure cracked at the edges. "You're going to tank this company out of spite." "No," Daniel said, meeting his eyes without flinching for the first time in his life. "I'm going to make sure it's finally run the way my grandfather intended." Patricia Vance set the documents down, glancing between them both with quiet interest. "Well then," she said, "I suppose we should get started."
Richard didn't wait long to strike back. 3 days after the board meeting, a courier arrived at Daniel's apartment with a thick envelope from a law firm Daniel had never heard of, Whitfield and Cross, the kind of name that suggested expensive suits and even more expensive hourly rates. Inside was a formal legal filing, a petition to invalidate the share restructuring, citing undue influence and questioning Elias Hensley's mental competency in his final years. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, sharper than anger. Grandpa Elias had been sharper at 81 than most people were at 40. To see his memory weaponized, reduced to a legal argument about senility, felt like a second insult layered over the first. He called Abernathy immediately. "He's grasping," the old lawyer said, unsurprised. "Competency challenges are common when people don't like the outcome of a will, but your grandfather was meticulous. He had 2 independent physicians evaluate him the same week he signed the restructuring documents. Richard's case is weak." "Then why file it?" "Pressure," Abernathy said. "He's hoping you'll settle quietly rather than fight publicly." But pressure cut both ways. That night, going through Elias's old financial records again, Daniel noticed something he'd overlooked before. A series of flagged transactions from years earlier, quarterly transfers routed through a shell vendor account, all authorized under Richard's signature. Small enough to avoid scrutiny individually, large enough, added together, to raise serious questions. His grandfather had flagged them himself in red ink, with a single word scrawled in the margin: "Confirm." Daniel stared at the page for a long time. Richard was trying to prove Elias hadn't been thinking clearly, but the deeper Daniel dug, the more it looked like Elias had been paying very close attention indeed, closer, perhaps, than Richard had ever realized. The legal fight Richard wanted was about to become something far more dangerous for him. The storage unit smelled of dust and old paper, a forgotten corner of his grandfather's life that Richard had never bothered to empty. Daniel had almost overlooked it entirely, a small unit rented under Elias's name, tucked away in a facility 20 minutes outside the city, paid quietly in cash for years. Inside, stacked in careful rows, were boxes of financial records going back over a decade. Daniel worked through them by flashlight, cross-referencing the flagged transactions from the ledger against invoices, wire transfers, vendor contracts. The shell company Richard had used, Sterling Logistics Partners, didn't exist beyond a mailbox and a bank account. No employees, no offices, no actual logistics work performed. Just a steady drain of company funds, funneled out in amounts small enough to slip past a distracted auditor, year after year. The total, once Daniel added it up, made his hands go cold.
Nearly $2 million, quietly siphoned from Hensley Manufacturing over 11 years. This was why his grandfather had rewritten the shares. Not out of paranoia, not out of confusion. Elias had found this, or come close enough to it, and built a wall Richard could never climb over, using the one tool Richard hadn't thought to guard. But as Daniel photographed page after page with trembling hands, a new fear settled in. These were originals, no digital backups, no secondary copies filed anywhere Daniel could find. If Richard's lawyers won early access to the estate's physical records, a request Daniel now realized was buried in Whitfield and Cross's petition, this entire storage unit could legally fall under Richard's control within days. Evidence Elias had spent years quietly compiling could vanish in an afternoon, boxed up and shredded by someone with every reason to make sure it disappeared. Daniel had found the truth. Now he had to make sure it survived long enough for anyone else to see it. The emergency board session had been called at Richard's request, one final push, Daniel suspected, to pressure a settlement before the competency hearing could gain momentum. Instead, Daniel was the one who asked to speak first. The room was fuller than before. Board members, estate attorneys, even Richard's own children sat scattered around the table, drawn by the promise of resolution. Richard sat at the head, composed, confident, already rehearsing the version of events where he emerged victorious. Daniel stood, placed a folder on the table, and began without preamble. "Before we discuss competency," he said, "I think everyone should see why my grandfather rewrote these shares in the first place." He laid out the documents one by one, the shell company records, the wire transfers, the 11 years of quiet withdrawals routed through Sterling Logistics Partners. Patricia Vance leaned forward, scanning the pages with growing intensity. Another board member exchanged a stunned glance with his neighbor. Richard's composure cracked in real time. "This is fabricated. This is a desperate—" "The bank records aren't fabricated," Daniel said evenly, sliding copies across the table. "Neither are the signatures, yours on every authorization." Silence spread through the room like spilled ink. Richard's daughter stared at the documents, then at her father, something shifting behind her eyes. Not loyalty anymore, but doubt. "My grandfather wasn't confused when he restructured these shares," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "He found this, and instead of destroying you publicly, he built a system that would stop you quietly, through someone he trusted to eventually understand why." Richard's mouth opened, but no defense came out. His lawyer beside him had gone pale, already calculating the liability of continuing the competency challenge under these circumstances.
Patricia Vance closed the folder slowly, looking at Richard with an expression that had once held respect and now held none. "I think," she said quietly, "we're finished discussing your father-in-law's mental state." The room had already rendered its verdict. Nobody argued when Daniel called for a formal vote. The competency challenge had quietly died somewhere between the shell company records and the look on Richard's own lawyer's face, a man now more concerned with his firm's liability than his client's pride. Whitfield and Cross withdrew their petition within the hour, citing in careful legal language newly discovered circumstances. Patricia Vance called the meeting back to order with the calm efficiency of someone who had been waiting years for this exact moment. "Given the evidence presented," she said, "I move that the board formally review Richard Hensley's continued position as CEO, effective immediately, pending full financial audit." Daniel didn't need to say much. As majority holder of Class B voting shares, his voice carried the weight the rest of the room now understood completely. He raised his hand in favor. One by one, the other board members followed, some out of genuine conviction, others simply reading the direction the wind had shifted. Richard sat frozen at the head of the table he no longer controlled, watching men and women who had laughed at his jokes for years quietly turn their approval towards someone else. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty completely. "I'm not doing anything," Daniel replied. "The company is protecting itself, the way Grandpa built it to." The final tally left no room for argument. Richard was removed from his position, stripped of operational authority, with the audit results to determine what came next. Civil consequences, restitution, potentially more.
Daniel didn't feel triumphant as the vote closed. He felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief. For years, he had been the one nobody thought to include in the room. Now, the room existed because of the one thing he'd been trusted to hold. The letter had been sitting at the bottom of the storage unit box the entire time, tucked beneath the false bottom of an old cigar case Daniel almost hadn't bothered opening. He read it alone, in the quiet of his apartment, the way his grandfather had clearly intended. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means you finally opened the box, which, knowing you, probably took longer than I hoped. I need you to understand something. I didn't give you the shares because you were the only one I loved. I gave them to you because you were the only one who never asked me for anything. Daniel's throat tightened as he kept reading.
Richard wanted the money. My own children wanted the ease. But you just wanted to understand things. You asked good questions in that study, Daniel, and you never once asked what any of it could get you. That's rare. That's the only qualification that ever mattered to me. I found what Richard was doing years before I got sick. I could have exposed him then, but I was old and tired, and I wanted to see who would find the truth on their own, without me holding their hand through it. I bet on you. I hope that wasn't unfair. Protect the people who work there. Protect what I built. And Daniel, stop thinking you were ever the leftover in this family. You were the only inheritance that mattered. Daniel sat with the letter long after he'd finished reading it, the apartment silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic below. For the first time since the day of the reading, he didn't feel like the outsider his family had spent years convincing him he was. He felt chosen. 6 months later, the 14th floor boardroom looked different than it had on the day Daniel first walked through its doors. The audit had confirmed everything, nearly $2 million traced back to Richard, a civil settlement negotiated quietly to avoid a longer legal battle neither side wanted dragged through headlines. Richard had moved out of state not long after, his name mentioned around the company now only in passing, the way people speak of weather that has already cleared. Daniel hadn't taken the CEO title for himself. Patricia Vance held that role now, with his full support and voting confidence. He'd learned enough from his grandfather to know the difference between holding power and knowing how to use it wisely. Instead, he sat on the board as chairman, present in every major decision, absent from the daily theater of running a company he was still learning to understand. His mother had reached out more in the past 6 months than in the 5 years prior combined. Even his step-siblings, once distant and dismissive, had started asking him actual questions, not about money, but about him. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Daniel visited his grandfather's grave, the same cigar case now resting in his own study at home, the letter kept safe inside it. He didn't say much. He never needed to. "You were right," he said eventually, the wind carrying his voice over the quiet rows of headstones. It was never about the money. He thought of the envelope Richard had once called worthless. He thought of the silence he'd carried out of that lawyer's office, certain he'd been given nothing. His grandfather had seen something in him long before he'd seen it in himself. Not the leftover. The one who was always meant to lead.